I'm Luke Story. For the past 22 years, I've been relentlessly committed to my deepest passion, designing the ultimate lifestyle based on the most powerful principles of spirituality, health, psychology, and personal development. The Lifestylist Podcast is a show dedicated to sharing my discoveries and the experts behind them with you. Ian Mitchell, you are on
Luke
the
Story.
Lifestylist Podcast.
Yes, and jazzed to be here, man.
Dude, I'm stoked.
Yeah,
I'm glad we didn't have to do this remotely. Thank you for traveling or fitting me in on your schedule here in LA.
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm stoked. Why is your name spelled like Ian but pronounced Ian?
Because it's phonetically correct. No, it's my mom is an artist, right? So she's a jeweler and a blues singer, and
She's a blues singer?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
so
rad.
yeah. When I was younger, I played in her band around New Orleans, and so yeah, she's a blues singer, and so she just, as the young impetuous artist, said, "It flows better. It's a stronger name." So, and as a kid, you don't really argue. So, hence it's Ian. So,
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, for those listening, never call him Ian because you'll be wrong. So, dude, I feel like sitting down with you because we've chatted quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I've listened. You haven't been on many podcasts, but I've listened to everyone I could find.
Seriously? That's
Yeah.
awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. And well, I do that anytime I interview someone. I'll listen to 2 or 3 of their podcasts to learn about them, get a sense of their energy, their knowledge base, but also to not ask the same questions that other hosts ask them, because why do that? So I feel like we could sit here for 4 hours, 5
Easily.
hours,
Yeah.
and just deep dive on so many rabbit holes. So I thought the way I might conduct this conversation with you is to do almost lightning rounds, because there's so many things that you have knowledge about that I'm curious about. And
Let's do
so I want to start the conversation with breaking down this thing called carbon 60 or C-60, which is a popular supplement in the anti-aging scene, one that I've heard of for years, but I didn't really know if it was legit. So many things kind of come in and out of my awareness. And it kept kind of reappearing. And then I stumbled across your company and did some research on that and figured, because I always want to find the best of whatever thing I find too. And your guys' products seem to be the best in show in terms of that. And I'm, after the fact, started to research it. And I just find this particular, I guess you call a supplement or molecule. We'll find out what the hell it is. I find it to be one of the staples in my routine now. And it's just become a thing. My body just likes this, but I don't exactly know what it's doing. So that'll be the first thing we touch on. But before that, just kind of give the audience a breakdown of who you are and what your deal is. Because I see you as this mad scientist wizard, but I really don't know officially what it is that you do in your lab back in Oklahoma.
Mad scientist wizard. That's
Okay.
That's actually, even the guys that work in the lab kind of use the moniker of mad scientist, because a lot of what I do is very different. And there's, and we've talked, so that I'm working on tons of different stuff. We've got, C-60 Health is like the main company I work with, but I do a lot of consulting gigs and other things. So I'm always tinkering with something, and I actually have a couple of different labs. So it's I work on like the crazy stuff like concrete and weird things, and trying to make a difference. Honestly, it is kind of a mad scientist, because whatever I think is going to move the needle and benefit humanity as a whole. Not to sound too much like a pageant, but that's really how I'm driven. Is I actually want to make a difference. So,
and what's your background and training?
Let's see. Well, I had a full ride to study chemistry. I studied chemistry. I studied jazz performance with Ellis Marsalis, UNO, and then just a lot of applied research. And I've honestly, pretty much anything that intrigues me. I have sort of an agile mind, and I just like learning things. There was a time when I really was into architecture, so I studied architecture and designed a bunch of buildings. And so there's a slew of things around Austin that I actually designed. And
oh, really?
Yeah,
wow,
yeah, quite a lot.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, it's just it is. It's truly it's all related, right? This is sort of our planet. So, and I kind of wanted to get my fingers wet and dip into a lot of different things and see how things function. And for me, a lot of it's patterns, right? So chemistry and music, people find them to be dissimilar. To me, they're actually incredibly similar, because it's all recombinant patterns, right? So you look at tones, or you look at different atoms, or how they interrelate. And you can usually force some sort of reaction, but I've probably prattled on too much about the elegant solution, because that's what I'm always trying to do. It's like when you're improvising, whether it's with compounds or whether it's with music, you can crush things together and they don't necessarily gel and sound good, and they're not harmonically relevant, right? But then you can also take that and expand on it. And once you have enough of a general knowledge base about how things actually move, you can figure out the elegant solution, right? You want a resolution that does what you're trying to do and conveys what you're trying to convey. So in the case of like carbon-60, what I was trying to convey was something that would benefit biological systems, right? How it would enhance cellular functioning. So I've done multiple things. I've worked with lots of guys on it. I have a bunch of patents in the space. And to date, I still think actually our company is the only company that's done clinical trials to suss out any of this. And it's because we started in 2014 with doing research and formally doing it. I had actually been taking it since 2012. And when I first read this report that came out in 2012 on lifespan extensions, I thought, man, this is interesting if this is legit. So I really drilled down and I bought all the equipment I needed to do it and started taking it in 2012 and then playing with it and making different combinations of it. And then we actually started the company in 2014, and we spent 2.5 years rather, actually just researching before we did any product. We didn't sell anything until November of 2017. And so we started at the beginning of 2014. But in the meantime, we did 2 full clinical trials and did a ton of research and started 2.5 patents, which then became 3 patents, which is now 4 patents. And so we've got patents on C-60 as it relates to stopping the metastatic spread of cancer and how it enhances biological function. And so that kind of tying it back to my approach to it, it's all you start with an end in mind. So in the case of how do you enhance biology, well, you go back to the basics. So in this case, I was looking at energy production systems, and that's all mitochondrial functioning, right? And so if you want to address mitochondrial function, you can address it a couple of different ways. A lot of people address it like NMN or NR or NAD, where you're doing NAD precursors or straight NAD, and you're trying to elicit a different response in the electron transport chain, basically amp it up, which is kind of akin to putting a larger motor in something and getting a response. And that's a phenomenal approach. I actually do that every day. I take 2.4 grams of NMN every morning with 2.4 grams of resveratrol. Yeah, it's like
holy shit.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that actually. If you read all the studies on that and you look at the best allometric scaling, the best results they got in all of the experiments that I was able to find when I allometrically scaled it from the rodent models to human models, the perfect dose was about 2.4 grams for my body weight. So, which sounds like a lot, and it is, admittedly, but I'm a big guy, and it seems to work well. And so that I agree, amping up the system, good idea. But also, it's kind of like if you were trying to redesign a car, right? You're not just looking for things to put a bigger motor in to make it go faster. You're also looking at eliminating inefficiencies. And in the case of carbon-60, initially people didn't realize that it would actually go into a cell, but when you combine it with a lipid, you can actually get it to move through a cell membrane, and it finds its way in because of a difference in the charge. It actually pulls to the mitochondria and then goes in and it wedges itself in the mitochondrial membrane. And so it's a buffer against oxidative stress. So it's kind of like you're plugging the leaks. So
it's a really tiny molecule then.
Yeah, it's just over. Yeah, it's like 1.1 angstroms, very teensy.
How big is it compared to a hydrogen molecule?
Not much bigger, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's super tiny.
Yeah, it's very, very tiny. You can fit hydrogen molecules in it, but yeah, it's not that anybody actually does that, but just in terms of scale,
right? You
can do that. Yeah. So it's a very useful molecule. In its nascent form, I mean, it's not something, it is naturally occurring, but not in large quantities, right? So you get just millionths of a part in, say, charcoal from burning or things like that. But in the quantities that we're trying to use it to elicit a really intense biological response. You actually have to synthesize it in the lab. There is, however, as NASA found, a range of it that's like larger than 27 times the size of Mount Everest, way in outer space, distant from us. But I don't yet have a wormhole generator to get there to harvest C-60.
Right.
So in lieu of that, we synthesize it in the lab. But it's a really cool thing, because when you start using it in the quantities that we're using it in, you get all these different effects. There's an old Hindu tradition, a thing called an Agni Ceremony, and it was basically you take a Shiva lingam, and you would put fire around it, and you would take the ash, the sacred ash. I think it's called bhavuti.
Yeah.
And you would pour ghee on top of the lingam, and it would drain down onto the bhavuti. And people would then eat that as prasad, right? Which is kind of like, the leftovers after a holy ceremony. And the lore was that it would extend your life 2 cycles, right? Which is like more than 200 years. So your lifespan would have been over 200 years. And it's interesting to me that, like legends from antiquity point this out. But when you look at the actual science of that, you go, okay, so these guys took a lipid. And I know that ghee does it because I literally did it this week in the lab. You can definitely bind C-60 with ghee. We do it all the time. That's one of the things that I use personally. And there's some people that I deal with that have a kind of a sensitivity to MCTs and also to olive oil. So every now and then I'll whip up a batch of something just specifically with ghee for them. And so these guys were doing that, thousands of years ago as part of the ceremony, and saying, oh, if you ingest this prasad, you'll live this much longer. And it completely lines up, because what they were doing is they were negating oxidative stress inside their mitochondria and increasing their mitochondrial efficiency off the charts.
So would you say then the main net positive effect of C-60 is in mitochondrial function?
Yeah. My personal take, yeah, I think it is, because you're able to buffer toxicity. I mean, it does a host of things, right? Because it's carbon, so it has a binding surface area that's far larger than activated charcoal, right? Because it's a perfect spheroid. It's a truncated icosahedron, so it's also known as a soccer ball, right? So it's got this very maximized surface volume. So it binds to toxins. So it's renally and hepatically protective. So your liver and kidney are buffered against toxins. So like in the lab, if you give it to a lab animal and then you try and knock them out with like CCl4, like carbon tetrachloride, you have to use a huge dose of it, like more than double the normal dose, because they just won't go down.
Really?
Yeah.
So if one was taking like the Revive here, for those watching on the video, I feel whenever I have someone's products out, I'm like, feels like an infomercial. But sometimes I forget to talk about it, or I want to like go, what's this thing that it says right here? And I'm actually going to do that because you have this
serapeptase.
Yeah. So I want to get into that. But so if you're taking this Revive C-60 product, is it going to act like activated charcoal and siphon out other stuff that you take with it, like supplements and things like that?
Not usually, not unless you take huge quantities of it, because there's sort of the pharmacokinetics of it, right? It goes in and it's going to stay for at least a couple of days, but we know that the majority of it goes out of your system pretty quickly, but over time it builds up, and it builds up in the mitochondria, and it'll stay there for months and months and then years and years, depending on how long you've done it. So I've taken huge quantities of this stuff. I would imagine probably more than just about any other living creature. And, the intent was to put enough time on the clock that I could actually make a dent in things. And hopefully that's what's going to happen. But it's interesting because this is like that particular thing, usually in the marketplace and in research circles, everybody thinks of carbon-60, and you have the maximum amount that you can solubilize into, say, a lipid, right? This one is actually 1.2 mg per mil as opposed to 0.8, which is generally considered kind of like the cap, but it's not, and people, I don't think, took the time. Like I spent about 6 to 8 months researching oils, because you've got, 1% C-60 and 99% oil. And then people were so focused on the C-60 that I think they lost sight of the fact that, the oil is a huge component. And some of the things were actually a little counterintuitive. Like there were certain oils that I thought the lipids would bond well. They didn't bond so well. Like MCT is great. Caprylic acid is better, like brain octane. That's really great stuff. But you only get a fraction of it, right? So you get like 0.35 to 4.0 mg per mil. Olive oil, you get much more. You get usually on average about 0.8, but that's kind of the cap. Well, I didn't really think that was the stopping point. So we've actually taken it up. I think in one of our patents, we have it up at 2.4 and we actually in the lab have gotten it far higher than that, but people don't really believe it. I mean, we've had third-party testing where they verify it because it's generally not thought of as something you can do. But if you focus on the lipids and you actually say, okay, it's the process is the binding. I mean, not to be too terribly esoteric, but there's, the observer, the observed, and the act of observation. So all things are important. So you've got, what you're actually diluting into or solubizing into, and then you've got, your compounds. But then the process is equally important. And so if you take enough time and you really drill down, like a lot of guys were thinking, like, high polyphenol count is going to be really great. Well, as it turns out, high polyphenols are great just in an olive oil because it's really beneficial for you. But if you want to get a really great response and have a longer lasting effect from the C-60, you don't want high polyphenols because it inhibits the binding capacity. So you have to negate some of that. And a lot of that stuff is just proprietary that, it worked out over years of doing it. Because the study that I had referred to earlier was this fellow named Fatih Musa did in 2012 at the University of Paris. And it was a really brilliant study. He was trying to do effectively an LD50 lethal dosing where you figure out how much of this compound does it take to kill these animals. And what they found was in lieu of killing them, it actually gave them a 90% boost in lifespan. And so it was
with overdosing them with
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was weird too because some of the things that stood out in the study is they didn't actually give it to them until they were all 10 months old. For a Worcester rat, which is going to have a lifespan of about 26 to 32 months, 10 months old is pretty old. It's about kind of late 20s, mid 30s kind of range. And then they dosed them, and then they didn't dose them. They only did it for I think 7 months total, and then they stopped, and they still had these really pronounced changes in longevity. But the group that just got olive oil, so there's a control group with just water. They died off pretty quickly, as expected. Then a group with olive oil, they got a 30% boost in longevity. And I'm sure it's because olive oil is really good. It's good long-chain fatty acid. It's got a lot of polyphenols inherent in it. So it elicits a lot of really beneficial effects. But the one with the C-60, they got a 90% boost in longevity. And I think that it certainly raised my eyebrows.
Wow. These are rats?
Yeah. And so
90% increase in longevity means they're living almost twice as long.
Yeah, that's right. So
wow.
I redid that experiment, but I used P53 knockout mice, which are they're the unfortunate tumor mice, the ones that develop all the idiopathic tumors just all over their body. And so the spontaneous tumor formation, right? And you use them for cancer research. And they have about the shortest lifespan of any mammal that I could find that I could really very clearly say, okay, these are the parameters and these are the mortality curves. And because people use them in oncology, there's so many tens of thousands of them, probably at this point, hundreds of thousands of them have actually been used, that they have very well-defined mortality curves. So within a really tight range, when are these guys going to die? And so I was looking for anti-inflammatory effects and some, different effects. But what actually happened is I got a 93% boost in lifespan on those guys in looking for the anti-inflammatory effects with what would eventually become that. And over the course of doing that, they didn't develop tumors, which was really weird. So I did the first necropsy on the first mouse that died. And when I opened it up, it had a femoral hemorrhage, but it had died, obviously, of a femoral hemorrhage, but it hadn't died of any tumor formation, which was really weird. So I thought, well, this isn't what I do. I'm just doing this as a curiosity in the lab. I really wanted to do it quickly. I'll send it off to a pathologist. So the next time one of the mice died, I sent it off to a vet pathologist, and they went through it. Same thing, couldn't find any tumors. Then the next one and the next one. And it was a small cohort. I think I only had 6 to start with, but one was undefined. One had a small mass, but it didn't die from that. They all died from old age. And they timed out at about 93%. And that was really early on. I mean, I've gone way past that now in terms of the effects I can elicit, because that was just at a 0.8 mgs per mil strength. And so now I'm at commercially we're doing 1.2, but in the lab I'm playing with things like I said, 2.4 and higher. And I'm just trying to see how much I can push the bounds.
So if you're getting a 90 to 93% lifespan increase in rats and mice, what would be the relative dose for a human in terms of like, I think when I do this, it's by the tablespoon. I probably do like a couple tablespoons a day, I'd say.
That's what I do. Yeah.
Is that
that is actually a couple tablespoons a day is akin to what they would be doing. Now they did very large doses, but they did them intermittently. They were doing the equivalent of like a cup of C-60 olive oil, but it was only, again, it was at 0.8 mg per mil. So what was really eliciting the big response there, they didn't have it in the same degree. So kind of as I've worked on this and the idea in my head has built, more and more clarity around what's actually going on, and I've drilled down and defined different things biologically, you can get the same effects with a smaller dose. But if you want to get a really pronounced effect, then you do that. Like this is actually patented because when I submitted it to the patent office, it got shot down the first time because they said, listen, you're taking these different compounds that all have a history of being anti-inflammatory agents. So 1 + 1 + 1 equals, or +1 = 4, right? It's because it's 4 basic components. And they said, we're not giving you a patent on that. And I said, but it's synergistic. So we did a bunch of testing, got a university to test it and sent it back. And we showed that we got a 230% increase in the effective rates of drops in inflammation and cytokine levels and things like that. And so once they saw that there was, it wasn't just a 1 + 1 kind of a thing, but it was actually a very synergistic effect where it got a big bump. They granted the patent. And so, but that was the threshold. Is I'm trying to figure out, how do you tweak things? That's why I take, NMN every day, is in the process of working on human biology and trying to figure out better ways to do that and working on just mammalian biology in general. What do you do, right? So you have to address both sides of the sine wave, the crest and the trough. And so that's what I'm trying to do, right? So I address one part of it by amping up parts of the electron transport chain, and then I address another part by diminishing the ability for oxidative stress to occur. And so at the end of the day, you end up with, I would like to think, a more efficient organism. I mean, I can tell you, have you ever seen the bulletproof product Unfair Advantage?
Yeah, the PQQ and CoQ10.
Right.
Yeah, I now use the Quicksilver Scientific. It's called the One.
Is that the liposomal variety? Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
That's Chris Shade stuff, right?
Yeah, same. It's got the PQQ and CoQ10, and I think that's pretty much it in that. But
yeah, those are really great synergistically. And if you play with them, like I was doing testing to kind of see what effects I could elicit on ATP in the lab with those, and we were testing ATP levels. And you can get some pretty crazy numbers out. I think we got a number that was literally a couple thousand, 3,313% exactly, a disparity in ATP production, which sounds crazy, but the reality is I just wanted to see how far you could push it. You can't actually do that because you'll end up flowing so many electrons over the membrane that you'll tear the membrane and it will pop like popcorn. So you don't want to make something so efficient that when it moves in and picks up a little photonic energy, it actually just explodes. That's a bad scene.
Oh, that's great.
It's totally doable, but my way of thinking, I always kind of like see what the parameters are, right? Like what's the low end threshold? What's the high end? How much of a change can I get? And in that case, it was a big shift.
And that was working with CoQ10 and PQQ?
Yeah, CoQ10, PQQ, and a couple of other compounds. We were actually thinking about producing like an energy formula for people. And at some point, I'm sure we'll do that. We've been working on a lot of other things. And, some of the animal products have taken a little precedence, and the Revive. And then we did a hair growth thing and some other stuff too. So there's just, that was actually just because my daughter was making fun of me. So that's why.
I want to talk about that in a bit too. On the C-60, so you've got improved energy production or ATP production because of the effect that it has on the mitochondria.
Right.
And then you've got an anti-inflammatory response in general.
Right.
And is anti-inflammatory the same as reducing oxidative stress? Do those go in hand, or are those two different things?
They're a little different, but there's definitely a correlation, right? So we did a bunch of testing, and we showed in one of the clinical trials, we pulled a bunch of blood and did cytokine analysis, right? And so we showed that we were dropping all of the pro-inflammatory cytokines and increasing the anti-inflammatory cytokines across the board, which was pretty cool. And I'll show you the graph. It's actually, if anybody's curious, they can go to the webpage and look at it on the C360 Health site, because I'm sure the graph is up there because I bandied about that it was very cool and needed to be up there at some point. So they're a little different, but they kind of go hand in hand, right? It's kind of like diet and exercise. Same net effect. You're better off at the end of the day.
And then what about I've heard buzz about there being like an EMF shielding side effect.
Oh yeah, there's actually
C-60? How does that play out?
Oddly, if you look at the studies, there's a really surprising shift in terms of your ability to handle radiation. Like in one of the studies, they were giving rats C-60 and then they were hitting them with doses of radiation to see what the effects were, and they were handling 8 to 11 sieverts of radiation in the group that was dosed with C-60, which is a completely lethal dose. And rats were just rolling on, doing their thing. And it's in terms of, say, like using it as a protective agent for, exposure to radiation, I would absolutely recommend it. And just EMFs in general, same thing. I don't have a lot of data on EMFs specifically, but I do have a fair amount of data on the radiation, and it's compelling. I mean, it's compelling to me. I'd be taking it anyway for the longevity effects. But if things go horribly awry, and I'm going to eat some Fukushima fish, I'd much rather have this. Fukushima sushi bar. I'd much rather have some C-60 in my system before doing that.
Yeah, in terms of overall health, being in the scene that I'm in and interviewing so many people about health, I've grown a little bit bored with the right diet conversation. I just interviewed Paul Saladino, the carnivore MD, who makes a very compelling case for just eating meat.
Yeah.
Nose to tail. Interesting. But other than that, I don't have a lot of conversations about like the perfect diet. Many people want to be plant-based or vegan, some are paleo. To me, the real thing that we should be talking about, I just want to see your perspective on, how those weigh, diet and lifestyle versus blue light exposure and EMF exposure. And the reason that, to me, unless you're eating just the really shitty stuff like GMOs, MSG, seed oils, canola oil, aspartame, like just the low hanging fruit of like the top 10, just absolute poisons, pesticides, glyphosate, right?
Standard American diet.
Yeah. It is like, as long as you're off that stuff and fluoridated water, which I actually want to talk to you about fluoride. If you got, and I know a lot of people don't have that stuff out of their diet, but let's just say that's out of the diet. To me, it's like, I have this passion about EMFs and the blue light thing because, and I'm sure many people that listen to this show regularly are really sick of this story, but it's part of my like hero's journey of, 24 years ago almost now. When I was 26 years old, I got sober. I started detoxing and doing saunas and colonics and became a vegetarian and got into herbalism and yoga and breath work and all the things. And progressively over these years, I've gotten healthier and healthier and healthier. And then, found out about the anti-aging stuff and now what's called ubiquitously biohacking. Before there was no name for it, before Dave Asprey came along, you were just a health nut,
Right.
God, I've been so into this stuff. And then I moved in this apartment prior to this one, and I didn't know I was living under 2 cell towers for 3 years that were about 100 yards from my bed. And my health was just shit. And I'm doing like, ozone 10 pass. I'm doing PEMF. I went and did 40 years of Zen. I'm doing, neurofeedback. I don't know anyone other than maybe like a Dave Asprey or Ben Greenfield that like was as committed to just being next level as me. I'm probably close to that level.
And it was still just hammering you.
Yeah, I was sick as shit all the time. I was just constantly had colds, flus, nausea, headaches, insomnia, brain fog, vertigo, just my eyes went bad. I had to start wearing glasses. And I didn't know that these cell towers were there. Now, later I discovered them, moved into this house because I got no cell service here. I was like, I'll take it. I was like, no cell towers.
And the
like,
pendulum
sold.
swings, right?
Now, of course, I have to have Wi-Fi on in the goddamn house, because there's no cell service. But anyway, and then all these symptoms started to go away, and I'm still leading that same lifestyle and haven't added a lot. I've added the C-60 and a few other key things that are kind of part of my daily thing. But that was a huge eye opener to me because I've got this really clean diet. I'm doing all the biohacks and I'm totally sick just because I'm living in that field of radiation and essentially getting radiation poisoning. So at that point, I was like, that matters more than what you're eating.
Well, I mean, it's like saying, oh, I've got a fantastic diet, but I carry an IV drip filled with glyphosate. But other than that, I mean, if you're in an environment that's constantly toxing you out, and that causes, I mean, electrostress is a completely legit and real thing, and it's very easy to test for and see. It's just not very popular because it kind of goes in opposition to what we're doing culturally, right? We're rolling out 5G and we're looking at all this, and everybody wants to be more connected, and electronics take a larger and larger percentage of our time. The downside is, biologically speaking, we haven't evolved with that. There's so much calcium ion channel dysregulation. You can completely screw somebody up just using EMFs. And anybody who thinks that, I mean, just look at a microwave, right? You're simply oscillating hydrogen atoms, and you can get things to boil with it just by oscillating it at 2.4 gigahertz, right? So once you hit the right frequency, you can make things happen. And a lot of the frequencies aren't tested for people, right? They could do things that would make them biologically beneficial, but they don't. And there's no real impetus because, the population is large and people don't complain. And in mass, I don't think we really think that clearly. It's unfortunate, but it's just the reality as I see it, is that kind of stuff is going to go away. Those companies have a lot of lobbying dollars and can put up a cell tower wherever the heck they want it. And I mean, I use my phone, but granted, I suck down C-60 like it's going out of style to try and buffer myself from that. And then I, sleep with my cell phones away from me and or off, so that I'm not, getting the bleed over from the transmissions. And I'm not a big fan of remote metering because those things put out ridiculously large pulses when they're, in test mode and things like that to communicate. And it is that EMF stress will damage you. People don't really think about it, but we've evolved in a Schumann resonant cavity, right? So the entire place we're in, and all of our cells have evolved from the time that we were, single-celled organisms to now. It's been oscillating at 7.84 hertz. And granted, there's a little bit of change over time, but we are not just, a meat suit. I mean, we're electrical, we're chemical, we're magnetic, we're photonic. Mitochondria communicate photonically, right? They do little femtosecond pulses of light. And when you look at bacteria, and my hypothesis is when you look at mitochondria, you see in bacteria there's a function called quorum signaling, where things reach a certain concentration and they start communicating across larger distances. And everyone just assumes that it's a chemical function. I actually don't think so. And based on some data that I have, that I recently did some experimentation in the lab at one of the universities I work with, and the results were weird. I mean, truly very weird. I need to run the experiment again in triplicate. And I showed it to a friend of mine who's a professor I work with, and he said, strange data. But what it actually showed is there was some transference of information just from photonics, which really isn't surprising since we know that's how mitochondria can communicate. But all of those systems, as a human, you're a combination of all those things. You're not just a physical organism, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to put your head in a microwave. Everybody knows that that's a really bad idea. Well, it's just waves. You can't see it. How bad can it be?
Yeah, I think that, and it's funny that most Wi-Fi routers also transmit 2.4 gigahertz, the same as a microwave oven.
Yeah, not such a good thing.
There's a debate. I want to see actually your take on this. Some people say that if you set your router at 5 gigahertz, that it's less disruptive to your biology, and some say that 2.4 is less. I tried to change to 5 on my router because more people say 5 is better, but then the signal sucks and nothing works. It's just not a strong enough signal for whatever reason. What would be your take on those two? And I know you're not an engineer, physicist, but just from your knowledge base.
Yeah, no, it's actually, after I'm done with working on all the biological puzzles, I want to play with, the next thing is going to be energy systems. I think that'll be the next big thing that makes a dent. And so I'm not, but at some point, hopefully I'll have enough knowledge to at least be conversant in those realms. I would be inclined to think 5 would actually be better for you, just because you're going to miss more in terms of your fundamental makeup. But again, I don't have a ton of data on it. I just kind of run based on how I feel, right. And so that's how the router's set in our lab. So, anybody's guess right now without all the data to support it. But I'm kind of inclined to go on my intuition that that's probably just a better thing.
Could you explain the calcium gated channel deal on the cell? Because I parrot that without really understanding fully what it is. I understand that, let me say my version of it is that your cell has an electric charge and EMFs disrupt that charge and allow calcium to flood into the cell in an amount that would never happen in nature. And that disrupts the balance of magnesium, potassium, and minerals in the cell. And then that wreaks havoc on the rest of you. But then I lose the plot. Is that close?
No, that is actually the basics of it. Think of it as an incredibly balanced system, right? Like, the perfect Rube Goldberg, where you push one thing here, the marble rolls down, shoots the balloon over, that blows the signal up to the next thing. Everything is really in balance. And that's why it concerns me when you start doing something like, if you have, I have the little earphones and I don't have ear pods or earbuds or whatever they're called these days, because that doesn't strike me as a really healthy idea.
Oh, putting Bluetooth on either side of your brain?
Yeah, man. I saw that and thought, whoa, that's not the best idea. So I actually still have the ones with the cord, and I'm perfectly happy with that because I don't mind little bitty tiny magnets by my ears moving a membrane, but I don't want something that's going to disrupt the flow, because those charges really don't take a lot to change the gating, right? So if you've got everything in a perfectly balanced system and then suddenly you put a big magnet next to it, it shifts the ability of those gates to open and close. And it does. It causes a dysregulation. And all of those different compounds like magnesium and potassium, they're all critically important at very, very tiny levels, right? So when you look at the way a cell functions, it is brilliant. It truly is. It's just like this, perfectly balanced, beautiful dance. Everything is in time and in tune. And anybody who's looking at that from the scientist perspective and isn't just in awe, I don't know how you could do that, because I am constantly in awe of how amazingly well devised and created we are. It's a brilliant system. But we can throw it off, and we do with all sorts of things. Like, one thing as an aside, you mentioned glyphosate. Glyphosate's really bad, right? Because it's a mineral chelation agent, and so it's almost like Agent Orange from back in the Vietnam era, and it's really molecularly it's very similar to that. But it dysregulates your mineral absorption. And the same thing. So all of the problems that you see from glyphosate, you can elicit the same effects if you use EMFs. It's just, which way are you going to push the object, right? Are you going to move this nail across with your finger? Are you going to drag a magnet above it? You're doing the same thing. You're modulating something chemically, or you're modulating it electrically. And there's really no difference. On that note, since I know you're always doing things to benefit your health, I sucked down a ton of sauerkraut juice with C-60 because, there were some really good indications and studies that I found that those two things in combination would negate glyphosate and take it out of your system.
What?
Yeah, and most things don't actually do that. Yeah.
Wow.
And it wasn't just specifically C-60. I do that because it's got the enhanced, surface volume and binding area, but it was activated charcoal, did the same thing. So sauerkraut juice with activated charcoal seemed to have a pretty big effect.
That's really interesting. Does it have something to do with the acidity of the...
I don't know. I haven't really had time to drill down on it, but I thought I read the study and the data was pretty clear, and they did it in cows, and I thought, well, okay, bovine study, this seems pretty legit. So I thought, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'll put it on the board to figure out how it works later. But I like sauerkraut, I like carbon.
That's good to know, because I always have some sauerkraut in there and it sits in there for a long time because I forget to eat it. When you have the munchies, at least for me, and open the fridge, it's never like, I'm really craving some sauerkraut. It's like, that's the last thing. So
my God.
I probably have like 5 half full sauerkrauts or some kind of fermented vegetables at any given time because I just forget about them in favor of whatever. Another thing about the C-60, I wanted to ask you, if for a guy, relatively my size, your size, perhaps a little bit less for someone smaller in stature, of course, say for my dose of 2 tablespoons a day is a good solid dose if I can afford it, is is there any downside to consuming that much olive oil every day?
No, there really isn't. It's actually incredibly. I mean, look at the Mediterranean diet. There are actually a lot of benefits to it. I mean, if you look at some of the kind of the pundits lately, like Stephen Gundry and some of those guys, there's a lot of benefits to consuming that, and a lot of that kind of relating to what I was saying earlier has to do with polyphenols, because polyphenols are really beneficial. I mean, you want lots of different colored veggies because you get a broad spectrum of polyphenols in your diet, and we don't really have that many sources of them. But olive oil, if you get a really good olive oil that has a very strong peppery aftertaste, that's because the polyphenol count is really high. And so no downside to it that I've ever seen.
And then tell me about why you put these other ingredients in here. So we've got the lipofullerene, which is the actual C-60 molecule that looks like a little soccer ball. Yep. And then we've got, I've not heard of this. Is this an enzyme? The
serratiopeptidase.
Serratiopeptidase. God, that is hard to say. Now, I've taken serrapeptase.
Same thing. It's a Serratia E15 proteolytic enzyme derivative. So, and it's silkworm enzymes, right? So, the serrapeptase thing. And so the reason for that is because serrapeptase has its own kind of cadre of anti-inflammatory benefits, but you can't actually, in general terms, unless you're taking a huge quantity of it, you don't really get it to where it's going, because it degrades, when it hits your GI tract, stomach acid starts to break everything down. It denatures the proteins, cracks them, and they don't have the same response. So in this case, and we've done a lot of the testing that you run is called Western blot analysis. We've done Western blot analysis to show that the proteins aren't broken, right? We didn't denature them. So, and we did it in high heat environments up to 80°C, and then very acidic environments to mimic stomach acid. Because what I was trying to do is create a buffer system so that I could get things to move into the body to where they needed to go. And that's one of the things. Like serrapeptase is great, but it was downgraded as from a drug to a supplement in Japan. It's probably been 7-8 years ago, because they found that they couldn't get enough of it actually in the bloodstream. When they would measure it, just enough of it wasn't there. So this bypasses that problem.
Is that because it's in lipids?
Oh, it's actually the C-60 buffers it. So just lipids by itself help, but because it has that buffer against the oxidation, because C-60 is interesting. It's an electron acceptor and donor, so it can do both. So it creates this really great buffer for things to go into your GI tract, so they don't get just whacked by stomach acid.
So I'm gonna get really geeky here. For anyone listening that's not super geeky, forgive us for just going here, but I'm so curious. So I'm really into the methylene blue, which I understand to be an electron donor. And so I do these transcriptions, little trochees that are called blue carnitine. And they've got CBD, nicotine, caffeine, and methylene blue. They also make one that's just pure methylene blue.
Wow, that'd be a hell of a synergistic combo.
They're dope. I'll give you a couple.
That actually, wow.
Yeah.
In what milligram ratios?
2 to 5, I think, of each or so.
Boy, I bet that turns your brain on
big time.
Yeah.
It's my favorite. My teeth are always fucking blue. And I always want to put one in for an interview, and I'm like, I can't because I'm on video.
Luke is the smartest Smurf I've ever met.
Yeah, it turns your mouth blue. But I've interviewed the formulator, Dr. Ted Achacoso, just amazing, really great guy. I call him the Cosmic MD. And so I started to understand a little bit about the electron donor thing, but I'm wondering if the C-60, since it has the ability to sort of shuttle in the serrapeptase, could you do a little dose of the methylene blue donor? And
I actually keep methylene blue in the lab. I've been playing with it for a while. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I would highly recommend that you do that.
Cool.
Yeah, because it's one of those things, because I work with nootropics all the time, right? And I've tried a lot of the things that I never really felt bright enough. So I was always kind of trying to push myself and get sharper and sharper. And so I guess it's been 7 or 8 years ago, I decided I was going to crack the puzzle, kind of like the NZT thing from Limitless, right? I wanted to figure out how to actually get my brain turned on. And so I started researching nootropics, and I came up with what I thought would be an ideal stack for myself. And I had been tracking my performance on the Cambridge Brain Sciences website, right? And so you can go on and you take this mental battery of tests. And I was never able to crack the 83rd percentile, which given, it's like 78,000 people in there and they're not slackers. wasn't bad, but it wasn't enough. And so I spent a couple months researching nootropics, and I ordered everything, and I got what would be my perfect stack, and I hammered back my perfect stack, and I got on and I took the test, and I just crushed it. I hit the 99th percentile, and it was great. But then a couple hours later, back to normal. But using those compounds like methylene blue to upregulate electron flow, I mean, yeah, anything you can potentiate like that. That's NMN has a byproduct that's sort of similar. Like you really feel it. And caffeine, nicotine, the molecular shape of nicotine, I think, is probably going to come into the forefront in people's minds here pretty soon because of the COVID stuff. Because there's been a lot of strange effects that people have noted, like people who smoke don't seem to have as much of an affinity for getting COVID at the same rates that normal, people who are non-smokers do. And I'm going to just put out a hunch, and granted, I have access to some research that isn't out yet, that it has a lot to do with the molecular shape there. But nicotine does elicit a lot of really cool effects. So nicotine combined with caffeine, yeah, that's a jazzy nootropic stack.
I have a nicotine right here.
Yeah,
nicotine lozenge. But here's the thing with the nicotine, and I'm going to get back to this, and also how to shuttle in the methylene blue more effectively. But I have a really sordid past with nicotine because I smoked cigarettes for a year. I mean, I don't know, 15 years or something. I finally quit cold turkey. I was good, no nicotine, and I knew that for me personally, the formula for being sober from something is you just don't touch it anymore at all because the slippery slope, like the gateway drug thing. So I don't smoke weed because I don't want to end back up on hard drugs, to this day. I don't have like a little sip of wine because I'm going to end up, being a complete basket case. Just the way that I seem to be made up. So I understood that principle of complete abstinence. So I quit cold turkey, didn't smoke for years. And then I was on a cruise in the Bahamas, and my stepbrother gave me a Cuban cigar, a Cohiba, and I thought, it's not a cigarette. What am I going to? I'm like, I'm not a golfer. Like I pictured like cigars, just only old dudes that wear Tommy Bahama shirts and play golf, smoke cigars. I'm like, that's not going to become a thing. Smoke one fucking cigar on the boat,
and your life is now centered around a humidor.
Yeah, the next port, I'm like, where's the cigar shop? Buy boxes of these Cubans. And then I spent like 4 years just huffing down literally like 2 to 3 Cuban cigars a day.
Wow.
Which is really expensive, really smelly, and makes you quite tired. So fast forward, I quit that shit. I completely quit nicotine cold turkey again. And then last year I started doing some plant medicine ceremonies. And oftentimes there's hape involved, which is like a snuff, which has some tobacco in it. And then these... I always forget the name of mapachos, these kind of hand-rolled Peruvian cigarettes in between a cigarette and a cigar, which is a tobacco rustico, really amazing, variety of tobacco. You don't inhale it, you kind of puff it like a cigar, and it's great in ceremony, and it has its magic in the world of plant medicines. And so in Costa Rica, I'm like smoking those, and I'm like, damn, I like these. I'm like, be careful. And I'm like, no, I'm good. I came back home, it's fine. And then I had this thought, it's like this addict, type thinking that, I had a cigar in my freezer for like zombie apocalypse and I'm never going to smoke it. And then I came back home from Costa Rica and I said, I was smoking these mapachos for a week. I was fine. So I can smoke this cigar and I'll be okay. Smoke that cigar. It's delicious. And then, didn't have any ideas to start smoking cigars. Then I went to a party. And this guy, Mike Cernovich, was there, mutual acquaintance, and offered everyone a cigar. And I thought, well, I was fine the other day. Had that one. Within a week, I'm back at the cigar store, smoking a Cuban, at least one every day. And that's been for like a month and a half, going on 2 months. And I crave it now. And because I started doing these little troches, these little lozenges. I found some organic, non-aspartame nicotine lozenges. And I really like the nootropic effect as you just described, but now I find myself like craving nicotine and getting irritable if I don't have it. And so smoking these cigars, I mean, it's a lot of nicotine, which would knock most people on their ass, but you get acclimated to it. So that's a long way of whining about my addictive personality and also saying, do you think there's a downside at a certain dose of nicotine aside from the addiction issues? But if someone's smoking a couple cigars a day and just getting hammered by that much nicotine, do you think there's a diminishing return?
Yes. definitively. Yeah,
Okay.
it's cytotoxic. I mean, if you use it in any reasonable dose, it starts killing cells.
Okay.
And you really don't want to do that. Now,
thank you, because that's going to give me motivation to get off.
Yeah, man. I was playing with this in the university lab last week. I'll show you the pictures. They're kind of ridiculous, but we were looking at the effects of nicotine on some stuff, and sure enough, pure nicotine, it's crazy lethal. I mean, it's very cytotoxic. You can use it to kill weeds and kill plants.
Oh, that's right. Because some people use it, like I think in biodynamic farming, they'll use a solution of tobacco juice essentially as a pesticide.
Yeah, it's very, very, very damaging. It can be in high concentrations, super cytotoxic. I mean, it's a very bad poison. So you definitely don't want to get your like millimolar concentrations up too high. Just kind of back off. The crazy thing is it's Paracelsus, right? The dose makes the poison. Mm-hmm. So if you use it judiciously, it's incredibly good. I mean, it makes your brain fire differently. On board, you have nicotinoid receptors, cannabinoid receptors, and opioid receptors, right? So there's obviously an interaction that needs to occur with all of those different things in our body because we're biologically geared for it, right? So cannabis has been around for a while. We've evolved with it. I'm a huge fan of CBD. I think it's great. THC, not so much, doesn't really float my boat, but like CBD, great effects. I think personally, I actually think you can elicit a better biological effect if you use a combination, because then you end up with all the terpenes, all the cannabinoids, and there's a whole host of them. I mean, there's 80 some odd cannabinoids. And shockingly enough, looks like nature figured it out. Give something impunity in a couple billion years and it actually comes up with the right answer. So I don't think we as people are really drilling down and saying, oh, we're just going to isolate this one fraction and it's way better. But as a whole, those are great, but our bodies are geared for them, right? So you take that in, it's geared for it. Same thing with opioids. I mean, kratom or kratom, depending on where you are, that's actually a great one.
I love that stuff.
Yeah, it's really good. I keep the crystal version in the lab.
Yeah. It's an amazing painkiller, and I will say the crystallized, the extract can get you straight up wasted too. I figured that out. Playing a little heavy on it, and like, oh, I'm feeling this in a way that I don't intend to feel it, but for like back pain and just kind of any kind of pain and wanting to just chill out, it's very effective. The thing that I found interesting about that, speaking about the opiate receptors, is my receptors were full of opiates for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So when I found out about kratom, or as the Thai call it, kratom,
which is now what I'm going to adopt. Kratom.
Well, no, I was dating a Thai girl when I discovered that. And I was like, you ever heard of this stuff, kratom? And she was like, kratom? No, it's kratom. It's like a gross street drug, because in Thailand it's very frowned upon because the government vilified it because people can get off opiates. So there's this whole weird history
of how that works.
Of the working class, the field workers becoming addicted to opium from working the fields. And then they figured out they could use kratom to get off it and free themselves from that.
It's a good thing that in this country, financial bias would never outpace or outweigh the importance of people's health. I mean, that would never happen.
I know, crazy, huh? But anyway, eventually I thought, I feel safe in doing that, and so I've used it as a plant medicine medicinally, mostly just for pain, and I've never found it to be habit forming. Although I have heard anecdotally that former opiate users and addicts can very easily get addicted to kratom because of its, I guess it fits the key.
Yeah,
the key
it's working on the mu opioid receptor is the specific receptor pathway. And
I never found it to be problematic personally.
I was actually looking at it because I was working with some people who had cancer and they needed some help with some stuff. So I was jumping in and went full on in on how you could get different effects by tweaking opioid receptors. Because there's a theory of cancer called the wound theory of cancer, where you kind of wonder when you see a tumor that's really progressing, why your body doesn't recognize it. Well, if the surface is covered with opioid receptors, and they in fact are, then anything that's produced in your body, an andamide or anything like that, just endogenously produced, gets sucked in and binds to the opioid receptors on the surface of a tumor, and hence it nullifies your immune system's ability to recognize it. And so there's a professor at Ulm University in Germany, Claudia Friesen, and she's done studies for the past 12 years. And I've got, I think, a 172-page paper that she published a while back. It was truly brilliant. And she was showing that you could just affect the opioid receptors on the cell surface of tumors, and you could get the tumors to start going away. And if you used it in combination with different chemo and sometimes radiation, unbelievably good results. I mean, just the tumors would just drop out of the body. Things that were, small cell lung carcinoma, glioblastoma, all kinds of things that are very difficult to treat. And it was just modulating opioid receptors. So, that was kind of my entree. But when you look at, she uses a thing called DL methadone, right, which is a specific type of methadone. I was thinking, well, that's going to be hard to recommend to people in the States because it's a Schedule I controlled substance,
right,
and people get all kind of wiggy jiggy about that. And especially with the opioid epidemic going on, people are not
right.
so. Hey, could you score some opioids for me so I can help these people out? That's not really going to happen, right? So you have to look at other alternatives, and one of them was kratom. And I thought, okay, well, this might be a viable option. So I looked at naltrexone, kratom, and then methadone in a different form, the form that's generally used in the States, and the effects were really surprising, right? That kratom didn't actually really work that well for the cancers, but naltrexone on certain types of cancer worked surprisingly well, and methadone, as Professor Friesen's research showed, worked phenomenally well. It was just night and day difference between what really generally happens with a tumor progression and what happens then. I was talking to a doctor here in California a while back, and she has the Center for New Medicine, and I was asking her about something, and she asked me what I was recommending, and I told her about this particular protocol from Germany, and she pointed out that one of her friends runs the International Oncology Association, and he does that with all of his patients. Prescribes that they go on methadone while they're doing chemo and radiation, and he, of course, is in Germany. And it's just as an aside, modulating opioid receptors is great, but you can also modulate cannabinoid receptors, because I have a friend here who I'll be speaking to later today, and she had cancer and just took cannabis. She worked at a cannabis company. She'd actually founded it, and she just took cannabis and got a 52% reduction over her entire body of her metastatic cancer. Now, that worked for a while, but then it all started coming back, because basically you call out what can be knocked out, and then the cells that are remaining propagate again and start to respawn and continue growing. But it's, again, we've evolved with those things. Nicotinoid receptors, they're there for a reason. Your addictive personality, in terms of the way you phrased it, might not actually be so much that it's an addictive personality as you might be noticing that there's something biologically that will enhance your performance if you get this certain thing. Because we're all hooked on being, or at least most of the people that kind of do the stuff we do, are all really hooked on being super high performing, right? Like push more, think more clearly, sleep less, eat better. It's pretty compelling, right? Because then you see the fruits of your labor. You're doing all these things that seem like, wow, that's a great response. I did this amazing thing. You might just be picking up something that you need, right? Your body may respond better to those things. I don't know. With your background, is it across all domains?
Well, it's really interesting actually, and I don't know. It goes into a complete other direction. It could be a long conversation in and of itself, but being around many people in recovery over the past 23 plus years, there does seem to be a type of person biologically that very easily habituates to different drugs, alcohol, nicotine, etc. And this other class of people that can kind of take it or leave it and even play with things here recreationally, medicinally, whatever, without becoming dependent on them. And so it's like there's the thought to become things quantum approach to it, is if you're sitting there going, I'm an alcoholic. I'm, and that's, it's part of recovery. And it's a weird kind of paradox there, because in my own experience, how I was able to break free from just a horrific life of absolute just bondage and desperation, and just, it was horrendous, my life before. I can't even describe how hellish it was. And the way that I was able to break free was achieving this being gifted the grace of a spiritual surrender, where I realized, like, man, I am addicted to all this shit. I'm an addict. I'm an alcoholic. And just really accepting that at a core level, and that in and of myself, using my own resources and willpower, I'm unable to overcome this thing. maybe if I avail myself to creation, to God, whatever you want to call it, that the thing that created me and created all these substances can actually free me from it. And so that was my mode. But part of that was really admitting to my innermost self that I was an alcoholic, for example. On the kind of positive psychology side of that, there's this belief that if you keep on saying, I'm an alcoholic, even though you've quit drinking, or I'm a junkie, even though you quit the junk,
right,
that you're kind of, you're cementing in this subconscious belief system that is self-limiting. And so I've always just been curious about both sides of that. I don't know what the answer is. I don't typically walk around thinking or saying like, oh, I'm an alcoholic. Even though my history has proven that when I touch that particular substance, it becomes a huge problem. So I just absolutely hardline 100% do not touch it, and don't believe that I ever will, God willing. But when it comes to some of the other things, there is, I don't know, there's an interesting kind of breathing room. So as someone who is addicted to opiates prior in a really bad way for a number of years, one would think, based on that logic, that I could never touch something that activates those opiate receptors like kratom, but I can and have and do, and it's not ever become a problem. I mean, I'm mindful. I mean, I keep a self-awareness about it, but it's not like I took kratom once and was like, I want to do this shit every day. It's just I forget I even have it until my back hurts or something, and I take it and I forget about it.
Yeah, but it seems like you've had like a really profound sort of shift in awareness. I mean, based on where you were and where you are and what you're doing, there's an entirely different light about it,
It's true. Yeah. I mean, because I have spent a lot of time and energy and, sacrifice, diligence, etc., in getting out of the core underlying trauma that was making life so uncomfortable that I needed to be anesthetized 24/7. So
certain things can only hold on. Like, if you look at it just from a frequency perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Certain things can only hold on to something else as long as it's oscillating slowly. Once you shift your frequency beyond a certain point, and I mean that in both the physics sense and the spiritual sense, because there's a whole lot of overlap of both of those things. I mean, if you really start drilling down and you don't get really attached to the idea of this is going to sound woo-woo or whatever, because we all preface things like that. Everybody I know in the sciences who has experiences or is looking at things that are a little bit beyond the norm, everybody prefaces it with saying, "Oh, this may be woo-woo," but the reality is it's just things we don't know yet. And you've shifted your particular field so much that a lot of those things probably can't hang on anymore. It would be horrifically painful to them to hang on, and not to go with the whole personification of something, but in a sense, I mean, if you look at a different frequency as saying, okay, this will bond just like a receptor. This can bond to this. Well, if you change the receptor site enough, it no longer bonds. And there are a lot of things like I've been working on olfaction, right? Just because of one of the things that I think is going to be really pivotal for humanity in the future is really getting a grasp on what's happening with quantum medicine. Like if I had my druthers, that's really what I'd be working on all the time, is like quantum medicine and quantum biology, because I think that's really where it's going. And so when you start looking at the core of what all these things are, it's how do things relate and cancel nodally based on frequencies. And if you think of objects as having a certain, as Buckminster Fuller, for whom C-60 is named as an homage, he referred to things as having a pattern integrity, right? Like you have the pattern integrity of Luke, I have the pattern integrity of Ian. Really, we're just vibrating fields of energy at that particular spot, holding a certain reference frame. My particular experience has been that all of that, again, not to sound too woo-woo, it's stemming from your consciousness, right? So you have a core consciousness that's evolving over time, and then you aggregate things together based on that. As it moves and develops and becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, those receptors on the surface that would allow you to bond with different things, they just go away. There might have been a point in my life where I would have been willing to do something that was mean or unconscionable, or those aren't there. Not to say, I was actually talking with a friend last night about this, about, addiction. And I made the comment of saying, well, I have issues with this, but it's not like heroin. I was joking about ice cream, right? Like, I love ice cream, it's not like a great thing for you, but it's something I really enjoy. Don't actually do it that often, but I really enjoy it. And I said, well, that's, kind of a failing. And he was like, dude, it's not a failing. It's not like, something else. And I said, well, I get that it's not like heroin, but, but if the impetus for it, if I really look at myself and kind of check the ego and don't take that voice into account and go, why am I doing this? What is the functioning purpose of this? What void am I filling? And I look at that. Well, it doesn't really matter what the devices that you're using to do that. If the issue that you're trying to compensate for emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and then fundamentally is sort of just a being, what is that thing? What hole are you trying to plug? When you really drill down and look at it, the same thing that people may be trying to plug with opioids might be the same thing that I'm trying to plug that day with, some piece of, ice cream or cake or whatever. It's what's the real impetus for it? So, kind of a long ranging conversation, but
it's interesting, because that I'm always getting down to the underlying root cause, and it boils down to that attraction aversion, right? There's pleasure seeking or there's pain avoidance. And so at the root of all addiction, it leads you down that path.
48% carrot, 52% stick, right?
and this is the phenomenon, really, I think that's so interesting to me. And what I started to unpack in 2019 was the world of clinical psychedelics and the shamanic, intentional ceremonial use of plant medicines, just absolutely curing people of lifelong addictions in one shot.
Yeah.
I mean, it's insane. So what's happening there is there's a rewiring or a healing of some underlying trauma that makes you seek that pleasure or that escape or that numbing agent, whether it's ice cream or a cigar or heroin, cocaine, alcohol, whatever. It's a really, really interesting field of study that I'm interested in.
Sometimes those things strike me as like a magic trick, right? In that you have this misconception or problem in yourself, and you keep running through it over and over and over with whatever the problem is. But then once you understand how the magic trick is done, it ceases to be a magic trick. It no longer holds the same allure for you. So if you see what's actually happening and you use, like, say, ayahuasca and really drill down and you get to the root cause of what the issue is, once you know and you can address the root, the issue's done.
Right.
There's no need for you to keep masticating and, just going over and over and over and over it.
I want to jump back to the C-60 thing, because I got off on many tangents there, which is great, but I'll be remiss if I don't talk about this. So back to this serapeptase enzyme and its inability on its own to get where you want it to go. I've heard that it has the ability to gobble up scar tissue.
It does.
And get into your joints and have benefits. How does that work if you're able to get it in, like you can here being shuttled in with the C-60?
Well, that actually, my partner, one of the things, like even if the company had never really gone anywhere, I would have been jazzed because I fixed up my dog and my partner. He had arthritis and really he had rheumatic fever as a kid. He's from Morocco and immigrated when he was 11. And so he had that lifelong, and he was an athlete, and his joints were really, really impinged. And in his mid 60s, mobility was just gone. And I used to tease him about having, crab claws, because he couldn't articulate the individual fingers well. He had to kind of close his hands like that. And so after about, it was a couple months in of using that, he had full mobility, the swelling was gone. And it's because once you drop the inflammatory response, right, the cytokines plummet, they drop out, the inflammation goes away, then your body perfuses the joints with the serapeptase, which then goes in and actually starts eating sclerotic tissue, right? And so the sclerotic tissue is incredibly similar to the proteins in a silkworm cocoon, right? So same fundamental structural makeups, and that's why, silkworms use it to emerge from chrysalis. We can use it to break down scar tissue. So every time you take a dose, the inflammation drops, the body realizes that there's a hot spot, it pumps it into that area, and it actually removes the structural media. So when the inflammation comes back, because it will until whatever the source issue is gone, it's less because you've actually lessened the physical media in that joint. So there's less of a problem. So as you take it over and over, it decreases, and structurally, in the most basic sense, structurally remodels the interior of those joints so that you're not having to contend with repeated insults that trigger an inflammatory response.
Wow, that's rad, because I have a lot of problems with my joints. I'm working on that. So if this, in this particular formula, in this Revive, if this is 2% of this enzyme, could one take a bunch of serapeptase capsules and dump them in here and maximize that? Or would
yeah. I've done it. When I was working on decreasing my cardiac, like calcium scores and things like that, and I wanted to drop out a lot of the things that are still kind of latent in arterial pathways, and that's one of the things that'll actually do it. So yeah, I up the concentrations many fold. It stings. So when you take it, it's as one person put it, spicy.
Right.
So I've had two people say that. One was about the dimethyl sulfoxide, the DMSO that's used on the hair product, is referred to that as spicy as well. And the other was when I made a formula just to kind of clean out all of my circulatory system.
That's very cool. I'm going to do that, because when I was working with serapeptase years ago, I understood the problem with the assimilation by just swallowing the pills.
Right.
So just, again, from my past, knowing if you want to get something in your bloodstream and get it past your gut, you can do it in an enema or just, like a syringe up the keister. So I used to make these super potent, I'd take a shot glass and I'd put maybe like 10 capsules of serapeptase in there and then stir it up with water and then draw it into a little rectal, syringe, and just take that and go to sleep to get what I thought would be that enzyme to bypass the gut and get where it was supposed to go. But this sounds like a much easier way to do it.
It is. One thing you were saying about your joints, and I noticed this with myself because I had an old soccer injury on my left knee, and using that dropped the inflammation, took out a lot of the scar tissue, and that takes it to a certain point. But this goes back to what I was saying about you kind of want to address both sides of the sine wave, right? The top of the wave and the bottom of the wave. So you want to do the things that are going to rebuild it and bolster it, and also take the things that are going to remove the damaged issues. You might want to look at doing like some PRP injections locally, because this isn't going to stimulate a huge amount of, biogenesis. Like, you're not going to pump out a whole lot of new, cartilage or anything like that. It'll remove the damaged stuff and you'll get a little bit of new cartilage, but based on where you are, you're probably better if you use something like really concentrated growth factors and do like PRP or stem cells or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm about due for another round of stem cells. What I've been doing lately is I'm on a pretty committed regimen of a really powerful cold laser, because I'm trying to cure this back problem, and also using the Pulse Center's PMF. So I'll do like 2 hours on my hip, which is kind of the main culprit with that PMF, and then do the laser and get a chiropractic adjustment. And I haven't gotten a lot more mobility in the joint, but the pain has definitely decreased a lot, which is exciting.
Well, I think the mobility, I noticed today I was doing doing energy practices, right? So the energy for success, Dr. B's stuff, right? So I do those every day, and I was doing them this morning, and there's one where you're moving your arms above your head, and I noticed my right shoulder popping quite a lot every time I did it. I thought, that's the next site for a PRP injection.
Yeah,
shoulder. Because I know that there's nothing left there that's inflamed because of the amount of stuff, that I suck down in terms of the Revive every day. But it's not rebuilding everything, right? So you can eliminate the acute onset of the problem, but you're not actually fixing it. And so for that, I pull a lot of my own blood and spin it down in a centrifuge and do injections.
Oh, you make your own PRP?
Yeah, I do it all the time. I do it literally like every week.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's so cool to have the ability to do that. And then what does the L-carnosine and CoQ10 in here do?
So the CoQ10 is magic sauce. It's just, CoQ10 is so good. It's a cofactor enzyme, but it's the difference between not having it and having it is shocking. The carnosine, the idea with the carnosine was to go back in and provide you aminos so that you could rebuild the support around something, right? So cartilage doesn't really grow that much. It's because of the blood flow, right? So something with a lot of low blood flow, it just doesn't grow that much. So the idea was, well, muscles have a lot, so let's bolster all these things physically by just enhancing the muscles around them and doing muscle repair. So that's what the carnosine's for. And carnosine also has a whole host of other effects. I mean, just cerebrally, it's great for your brain. It's good for your muscles. But when you combine that with the CoQ10, you really do get a big boost. And I know this from doing all the ATP studies. If you buffer CoQ10 the way I've got it buffered in there, you get huge numbers. And like I was saying, we did that 3,313%. You can't actually do that because you'll hurt people. But once you know where it's at, you can ratchet it back until you get some really pronounced numbers. And this goes back to the same point about addressing both sides of the wave, right? So the CoQ10 enhances the cycle. So you're actually able to pump more electrons and you're enhancing the ETC. The C-60 knocks out the loss. So you're putting a big motor in and you're also trimming the weight on everything else.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
Having listened to some of your interviews, as I said, I think you're, as you said, motivated more by impact than by, dying with the most toys.
Yeah.
But I really respect that. I mean, I have a couple friends that own companies, and I'll have them on my show, and I'm kind of like nudging. I'm like, dude, plug your shit, and they're just that's not what they're about. But what I've noticed in your interviews is you don't like diss other C-60 products.
No,
but to me, the space is very competitive, and it's difficult to kind of hack your way through the weeds of what the bullshit C-60 is and the real deal stuff. And I think because I'm just like obsessed with finding the real deal, that's why I settled on your product, because I just research as much as I can. But it's kind of like the CBD industry is very similar. Everyone claims to have the best extraction and balance of the THC and this and that. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I found a brand I like.
It's weird, but actually.
The C-60 space is weird. It's like really competitive and sharky. It's kind of like there's two other industries: the sauna industry and the air purification industry are very kind of catty, and there's a lot of competition of who's doing it right and who's not, and it's weird. And in the supplement world, C-60 seems to be this. It has its own little kind of community of
it's a little strange.
Battles of who's doing it right.
Well, one of the things, and I'm never going to, diss any particular person, because really, I hope it gets out to more and more people. The things that I can definitively tell you, because I've actually done the clinical research on this, is a lot of people hinge on like, oh, is it 99.99999 or 99.5? Or there's, biologically speaking, such an infinitesimally small difference between those things that it's great if you're selling it because you can say, oh, it's 99.95. And you can charge a lot more, but you're not actually changing the biological effect that you get. Even if you go down to, we tested it all the way down to like 99.5. Same basic biological effect, very, very minuscule differences. And again, I think a lot of that's just profit driven, right? People are trying to hawk something at a higher price. And so that's what they do. And you can definitely there's a lot of people who do it with MCT and a lot of people who do it with olive oil. I'm just happy that it's getting out there, but it does kind of frustrate me sometimes when I have people send me things and you're like, oh, these guys say it's impossible that you can't get this density. And I'm like, well, that's just poor thinking. We've had third-party verifications and sure you can. Anybody could if they just thought about the process a little bit instead of just going, let's focus on this 1% instead of addressing the 99% of this other component, I hope that it levels off a little bit, but there are a couple of companies that I've seen where it scares the bejesus out of me because they're selling just amorphous carbon and it's not carbon 60. Like definitively, if you run a spec on it, because I've got an HPLC in the lab, if you run a spec analysis on it, it's not C-60, right? The peak is in the wrong spot. And if you're not getting that nice handy dandy 720 peak, it's different. And they just keep hawking it. And I talked to a fellow who actually runs he posts a bunch of stuff on his site about C-60 and does all these different analytical things and compares the prices and the ratios. And he called me one time. He's a really nice dude. And we were talking and he said, well, I'm taking this stuff. And I said, that's cool, but it's not actually C-60. And he said, well, I've gotten these great effects. And I said, yeah, that's true. But you'd get those same effects just from taking activated charcoal. The problem is if you continue to do that, I mean, you don't want to hammer down activated charcoal on a long-term basis, because you're going to deplete yourself of other nutrients. I mean, it's going to literally suck them out of your system. And sure enough, I think it was only literally like 3 weeks after I had that conversation, he called me and said, I had to go to the hospital. Turns out, and it was exactly that. And that concerns me, because as an industry, it's such just a fledgling little industry. There are a ton of companies doing it, but ton really equates to maybe 20 something now. And I think maybe 1% of the populace actually has even heard of this. So it's just such a new thing. I worry that the infighting is going to have a detrimental effect, and that somebody's going to do something stupid or make some ridiculous claim and actually shoot it out of the saddle. Because there are a lot of technologies that are really good, that have great data behind them, that you'll never see, because there's political influences at play, monetary influences at play, and I don't want silly infighting to do that to this industry. So yeah, I will not necessarily go after someone, but just do your homework, check, proceed with caution, because there's some good groups out there, and some doing like the MCT based stuff. I've talked to most of the guys in the industry, at least like the top tier guys. I actually like most of them on a personal basis. I don't necessarily agree with the way everybody approaches their business. And for me, I've been trying to get the cost on this down, and my partner Dan he's great at ratcheting down the cost on things, which is terrific, because the more we're able to get this down to a price where everybody can get it, the more ubiquitous it'll become, and then people will have those effects. And it's just kind of this, snowball of good that builds, which is what I'm shooting for. But I don't know. Again, I don't know that that's everybody's motivation.
And when it comes to the different ways that the C-60 molecule can be made, is there a hierarchy of,
in my
chemical reactions?
Well, ultimately, at the end of the day, when you're ending up with C-60, everybody says, "Oh, it's C-60 is C-60," and yeah, that's true-ish. It's a little odd, because it delves with a lot of things that are kind of bordering on more physics that aren't really standard chemistry, right? So you run an analysis on like a GCMS and mass spectroscopy, right? So you do that or liquid chromatography, and you see what you're dealing with, and it'll read out as C-60. But in my experience, having done so much of it, I've tried things from flame synthesis, things from plasma arc synthesis, things from the standard synthesis, where like the one that we have, where because I actually have a carbon arc, and we built it just to actually start producing our own stuff. And the majority of what we get is actually not our own, because it's not really at scale. But in dealing with that, yeah, there is a difference. I've noticed a difference in feel. I haven't quantified it yet, because the equipment, when things read out spectrally the same, everyone just says, "Oh, that's the gold standard. It's the same." But when you can notice a difference, there's something more happening. And as a scientist, it's kind of incumbent upon you to look at that. And this is, you and I were talking before the podcast, and I was mentioning that experience I had with the protein powder, right? So Dr. B, we were at a conference, and he opened up a pack of protein powder and separated it into two pieces, and put his hand over one piece, and then said, "Taste them." And so I tasted them, and the two pieces, or like the two sides, entirely different, right? And so much so, I asked him, I said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, "Well, this one, I charged it with source energy, and this one is, just the regular." And the one that was charged was delicious. Like, I was drawn to suck that stuff down. And I brought it back to the house where I was staying, and had the friend that I was staying with, I had her try it as well. Same thing. One was fantastic, the other one, eh. And having seen him do that, it triggered something in my head, which is, well, okay, nothing is changing chemically, right? It's the same compounds, but something is changing. So what is that something? And my hypothesis at this point, and I've been developing equipment to actually test for this, is that you're starting to look at differing states. And I always loathe it when people use quantum, because it's like quantum synergy. It's scientific terms that people don't really understand, that they throw around a lot. But in this case, it truly is that. It's something that's at a scale that's like, Planck length kind of scale. You're changing the function or the spin of more likely than not, the actual spin of electrons. And so you're changing something's energy state, like its inherent energy potential. And when you do that, and I know from the experience, it tastes different. So if you can see that something tastes different, it means that there is a mechanism to test for it. We just may not have it yet. So in the C-60 world, when I tasted something or ingested something rather from a plasma arc process versus the standard electrical arc process that we use and most of the guys worldwide use, there was a difference. And I know what the spectral analysis says, but I also know what my body says. And of the two, I'm inclined to go, okay, chemically it's the same, but something's different. And so, in my experience, the standard method is the one that feels the best to me, which is just, electrical synthesis, where you take two carbon graphite rods and you pump high voltage through them, and then you form an arc between the two, and then there's a little explosive plume, and then you sift that out, and you only get 7% or so C-60 when you actually filter it out and then run it through a column. But that's the one that feels the best. The plasma arc looks a little different, feels a little different. It actually, the color's different, which you can say that's because of particulate size, but even when you ball mill the stuff down and make it more refined, it still has a different look. And again, there are things that we don't have the technology to explain yet, but when I personally experience something like, oh, this feels different, well, that's, I'm inclined to say there's something different. We just don't know, which is actually what I had mentioned earlier about olfaction. For the longest time, people said, oh, smell, it's this lock and key system of receptors. And it's really not. It's a quantum function based on vibrations. And there have been a lot of experiments that are actually showing that. They've genetically modified some different flies so that they could actually smell different compounds and move towards one or the other. And even though things had the same molecular configuration, they would move towards one. And I'll reference a book. I'll send you a link to it. But things change vibrationally that we, just in general science as of yet, we're not addressing. We're not there yet. In 50 years, I'm sure everybody will be like, well, duh, that's this.
Yeah, this is the most exciting thing when it comes to health and longevity and making progress there. It's like at the Joe Dispenza events, you have these coherence healings.
Yeah,
where they train a bunch of healers to stand or sit around or over the Healy that's got in some cases cancer and a tumor or dysfunctional knee or whatever, something's wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
You have all these people get in coherence, mind, heart connection, send healing energy and love to this person, and they're cured on the spot.
Yeah, and that happens, and that's a quantum function.
Yeah, and that's a realm, but it's like the narrowly skeptic, scientific, lockdown, Newtonian physics based model does not allow for that. And so to me, that's where I want to go, like right in there. To me, that's the most interesting because it can't really be explained. Or at least not that yet, easily.
But it will be. And that's the thing. It's funny that you say that. I'll show you what I sent over to those guys yesterday, to a doctor, Tammy Morelia, who's working with them. I wrote up a protocol to do testing for that, for the effects of meditation on the propagation and proliferation of stem cells using a CD34 assay. So you can isolate how many new stem cells are propagating through a person's system at the start of the week when they take their blood, and then at the end of the week.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, they're going to
cool.
have to wait, I think, until Tammy was saying yesterday, until October, when they can get a group of like 1,000 people together again.
Right.
Yeah, but that's actually, it's funny timing because I literally just wrote the protocol up for how to test for that.
That's one of the coolest things about his events is there's a team of scientists. They have people on QEEGs. They're drawing blood on everyone.
Yeah.
And at the end of the week, and then he shows you the results and all the brain scans and all this shit. It's crazy. Just from getting in heart and brain coherence and just having some intention. And
yeah, man, it makes all the difference in the world. When I was a kid, I had really horrific migraine headaches, and I had them like 3 or 4 days a week. And I had scans and tests, and nobody could find anything. So on a whim, my dad said, let's try this new thing, biofeedback therapy. So he got me into biofeedback therapy when I was 11, and I started doing really heavy duty brain training. And once you've got the colander with wires on your head, and once you realize what you have to think and feel in order to change, the readout, and you're getting it in real time, it gives you an entirely different toolkit and a whole different way to address, like, oh, this is what my physiology does here, and my mindset changes that, and the frame that I'm in affects this, and you can see it with temperature and respiration and blood pressure and pulse rates, everything, all the things that were considered generally to be autonomous nervous system functions. They're not. They're well within your control. Then I think on average, though, people probably wouldn't want to take control of that because it's a whole lot of extra stuff to do. Mentally, if you're barely just hanging on, you probably don't want to try and take control. And now I'm going to take control of my breathing. It's too many balls in the air when you're juggling, but it makes a profound impact. And so the stuff that Joe Dispenza's doing intrigues me because I think that they're going to very easily prove out that there are all these effects happening when you do get coherence, because coherence is a big thing. I mean, we were talking earlier, it's a light bulb and a laser, right? One warms a hot dog and one punches a hole through steel. Same number of photons. The difference is coherence. When you have everything moving in the same direction at the same time, you get these huge order of magnitude shifts. And biologically, that's where I think Joe Dispenza's stuff seems like it's going, is really sussing out the actual metrics to say this is this and this is this and this is this. And I know that's where we're going to get 50 years from now, or maybe 100 years from now. I'm very much looking forward to that, because a lot of the stuff that everybody says, oh, it's very woo-woo. It's really not. We just don't get it yet. It's like DMT intercalating inside your DNA, right? My take on that is that it simply shifts the frequency response for what you're able to pick up, right? So many people have the same effects when they do DMT. They have, they'll have all the people in the room will see the same sorts of things going on, and they'll, the clockwork elves and that kind of stuff. Well, more likely than not, all that stuff is probably just occurring, because if I were going to design a universe, it certainly wouldn't just be what we're seeing. It would be very layered, because otherwise it would be very wasteful, right? So I would have all these things layered on, slightly out of phase with one another, so that you can have everything moving in the same spatial relevance and the same temporal relevance without having them interact, right? You just slightly offset them, like electrical systems, right? Slightly out of phase, so that they don't crunch into one another. But then when you take something that intercalates in your DNA, that's fundamentally shifting the tuning, so the dial on the radio goes to a slightly different spot, and suddenly you can see. Like you were talking about.
Wow, that's trippy. That's
like
a cool
ayahuasca, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think the odds are realistically that people arrived at, like, oh, well, we're going to take this compound and then we're going to take this compound out of the literally tens of thousands of different plants that they could have used. They ended up with the two perfect things to have, one reaction and then another amylase to block it. I mean, really? The odds on that are pretty damn slim mathematically, right? And so
they're smoking the poison from a bufo toad.
Right.
I always think about that those type of things. I mean, like mushrooms, that's pretty easy.
Yeah,
you're
right.
hunting, gathering. You see the dog ate some of those mushrooms. He's acting crazy. So you take some, you don't die. And then everyone learns about, mushrooms. But with the ayahuasca, I've thought that too. Like, were they just, who was the first person that was making some tea? I was like, I'll take a little of this, little of that. And I was like, oh shit, I'm seeing aliens.
Well, and what they actually say is that the plants told them, like, where did you come up with this? Well, the plants told us. And that makes perfect sense if you pull back a little bit and think of things as more consciousness than as just physical organisms, right? Because there's a whole lot more going on. I mean, you and I are capable, we pick up things in a very narrow EMF band. Right? Just visibly, you've got like just a couple 100 nanometer spectral bandwidth that you pick up, like best case, like 400 to 700 nanometers, and maybe a little bit on the outsides of that. We have all of the onboard equipment to process a lot more of that. I don't know if you saw any of the stuff where the guys were using a chlorophyll derivative to give people night vision. So they made drops out of a chlorophyll derivative, and it gave them night vision. And so you have the onboard the onboard mechanisms to process it, but you don't actually have the compounds that allow you to see in that range. And they also did a similar thing with retinol A derivative, and it gave them the other end of the spectrum. So they were seeing things like insects see, and so again, we have all the onboard equipment. We just normally don't have the compounds that trigger that, which makes me think, a lot of the people that see things in their field of perception that are different than what the average person sees, they may just have some, genetic trait towards making a different compound that allows them to see a higher frequency band. Or they may have some experience that triggers that compound to be produced. And hence they go into a state where they can see, auras in this thing or that thing. It's not biologically, it's not without precedent. And with regards to just, the trees saying like, oh, well, we told them to do this. Yeah, totally plausible. It's some sort of different communication. I mean, if you look at the biomass of mushrooms, there's that ginormous cluster of mushrooms. When you look at the electrical impulses going across that, if you look at that and don't go, damn, that sure looks like a neural network, you're kidding yourself. I mean, and to think that we're the only thing that has the ability to process and have thoughts, that's just silly.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes eating mushrooms to realize that.
Right.
The last time I took mushrooms, I was out in Yosemite, and I had this experience where they were like my little buddies. They absolutely had this consciousness that it sounds crazy now talking about it, because you're like, what? How's a fungi alive or conscious? But there's no way to explain it unless you had the experience, I think. But it was this realization like, oh, these are our allies. These little buggers, in our environment are part of our, essentially like, or not even allies or friends or tools, but more like brethren. It was like, oh, we all come out of the ground at the end of the day, and we're related in that way. And there was this really neat experience of relating to them specifically in that way, and going, oh, there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye, that just can't be explained. Or you just did a pretty eloquent explanation of it fundamentally. But when you get into those altered states of consciousness and you're changing your tuning fork into those other dimensions, when you're in it, it's so real. And then when you come out of it, you're like, oh, that must have been a hallucination, that I was sensing these energies or this communication with the plant world or animals or entities or whatever it is. But when you're in it, it's so visceral and so real. And I think for me, why it is real is because I come out of it. And even though I go back to this narrow bandwidth of awareness and perception, I'm still able to take what I learned or gained there and bring it into this narrow bandwidth of experience and use it.
Right.
Therefore, what was brought back from those dimensions is applicable and tangible here. Therefore, those other dimensions are as real as this dimension.
Yeah, sometimes I view it like, I used to swim a lot, and if you're swimming for time, sometimes you'll hit a great time, right? You'll have a number that's like, woo, I did something amazing. You can do it. You can access that state. You're not generally able to access it, but with training and work, you can get to a point where you can access it. I don't know. Have you ever seen any of the studies about people who have had a corpus callosectomy, where they actually divide the brain? Mm-hmm. So the corpus callosum is the segment in the center of your two hemispheres. And due to, sometimes accidents and sometimes epileptic concerns, they would do a corpus callosectomy. And some of the studies, when the two hemispheres of even the brain in the same person weren't able to talk, were amazing to me. There was one study where they would they would tell someone that they were going to hold a spoon, and they would put their hand, but they would do it with their left hand. They would put their left hand behind a curtain, and they would give them a fork, even though they said it was going to be a spoon. And they would say, what are you holding? And the person would audibly say, oh, I'm holding a spoon, because that's what they were told. And their head would literally start shaking, no, left and right. And the people would go, why is my head shaking? Because they didn't know with the verbal processing, on the left hemisphere of their brain, the analytical component, they didn't know what was going on, even in their own body. But the sensors, they were feeling it with the left hand that, oh, this is not what I'm being told. is going on. And so the only way it could communicate was through the body. Nonverbal, but it was still a communication, and their head would literally shake left and right. And and admittedly, I'm sure that freaked the heck out of a lot of people, like, what's going on in my body? Well, it's trying to communicate. But it just goes to prove the point that there's a lot of communications that can't pass through the filter of linguistics, right? They're things you have to feel and you have to perceive. Like if you go back to some of like the old Hindu texts, like the Vedas, right? And then you look at some of the more detailed things, like there's a book called the Shiva Sutras. And the Shiva Sutras, it goes through kind of like a breakdown of how is a human created, right? And in terms of the stratification, the concept of emotion falls before the concept of intellect. So intellect is a construct that's built on top of emotions. So there will be times, according to their methodology, where you can feel something, but you have no words for it. You cannot put it into words. And that's an experience that we've all had. Like everybody's felt that, right? Like feel the most love you've ever felt for another creature and describe it perfectly in words. Well, you can't. It doesn't mean the experience is any less real or tangible or palpable to you. It just means that there's not a linguistic construct that's going to accurately hold that. And I think that's where things get lost. And the same thing applies to the sciences all the time. There are things that we see and that we feel, but people are afraid to pull the thread, whether it be because they're going to lose funding or the university doesn't want to back it or their company's going to be upset because they might make their own products obsolete. There's all sorts of reasons. I used to think that if you build a better mousetrap, if you're really inventive and you really try and push and bring the things that are necessary for humanity to really move it forward, that, the world will beat the path to your door. Unfortunately, not the case. It was kind of a rude awakening when you do actually in earnest try and build the better mousetrap. The company that has the lame mousetrap really tries to make sure that they've buffered things in such a way that the lame mousetrap still has its market share. And you see that it's pervasive through all of our society. If humanity would kind of check itself at the door and move with the Star Trek future instead of the sort of Star Wars future, where we were all moving in accord, trying to do things for the betterment of humanity and expand our horizons and work together intellectually and appreciate one another culturally. That's, God, right now, that's super evident, things would be far better, and maybe it'll move that way, but I think it's going to take a little while.
I want to ask you about why my dog is so awesome taking this C-60 companion. Because I've always wanted to biohack my dog, and I have.
You definitely have.
One thing I did that was I think the first most noticeable and impactful is I put her on deuterium depleted water. Mm-hmm. I adopted her when she was like 3. She's probably eating just straight like full on carbohydrate, GMO, deuterium, solid deuterium dog food.
150 parts per million.
Yeah. So I started giving her like the 85 ppm water exclusively. And I did that for about 3 months. And she had all these hot spots and was always itching and biting herself and just tons of inflammation. And this was when we were living under the cell towers too. So it could have had something to do with that. But while still living there, I got her on that water and just completely knocked all that out. And it was like, yes.
Again, it's, the DDW functions by literally allowing the little nanorotors inside your mitochondria to spool. They roll at 9,000 RPMs. They're little micro machines or nano machines inside the mitochondria. And when you eliminate that extra weight load, they just function more effectively. So your ATP levels go up, your ability to process and deal with sickness goes up. I'm a huge fan of DDW. Actually, I think it's a great thing.
So aside from that, the only real major intervention I've done is I've started to give her Cookie. She's not in here. Usually she's sitting on the guest's lap. She must have got locked out. She's kind of my co-host. But I started giving her this, and she wasn't having any problems, after the skin thing that I could quantify. But and she's relatively young, so she's pretty energetic. But she is on really good, dehydrated raw food and like everything super chronic. But when I got her on this C-60, her energy levels are off the freaking charts now.
Oh, it's true, man. But it happens with us too. At large scale, it works with people. We actually, when we first launched and actually started selling things in 2017, we just did the pet product first. And because we thought it was going to be a much easier barrier to entry, there'd be less regulatory issues and things like that. And so literally a couple of weeks after we launched, we had all these people calling and ordering, and I got one of the people on the phone, and I was talking to him, and I said, "Okay, so what animal are you giving it to? Are you giving it to dogs, horses? What?" Like, animal? What are you talking about? I'm taking it. And it turned out with a lot of people that they would see the effects on their dogs, and then they wanted that effect, so they would start taking it. Like, lame dog gets up and starts running after a couple of weeks, and people wanted that same effect, and they got it too. It's the actual patent for that is, it's for mammals. Like, if you read the title of the patent, it's cellular enhancements for mammals. So, cellular enhancements in biological systems through the use of lipofullerene peptide combinations, I think, and it's all mammalian enhancement. And I know it works on other critters as well, not just Kingdom Animalia, but Insectivora as well. So you can definitely make positive changes across a whole host of species. Because one of the things I hope at some point somebody starts tinkering with that and doing more for bees and other insects that need protection against EMFs and things like that.
Oh, interesting. Damn,
Yeah.
I know the bee population. It's the funniest thing happened a couple days ago. I realized a bunch of my old website emails were going to spam. And so I went through and had like 367 old emails from the past 6 months that had been ignored, like inquiries to my website. And so I'm like going through them one by one because no one else can do that at this point. And one of them was from this PR company who reached out to me as a health influencer and wanted me to promote 5G. And wanted to pay me money to say, "Oh, let's get 5G going," and it's just hilarious, man, because I'm like, obviously you didn't do your due diligence. I've done like so many podcasts just about 5G with Jack Cruz and all these people. And but I thought, I thought about it, not thought about doing it, but thought about what my response would be without being a dick. They're just doing their job.
Right.
This girl probably has no idea that it's bad for you. And I, without being too snarky, I answered the email and I said, I wanted to say, you're on the wrong side of history.
Dear Charlotte, you're going to die.
Yeah, you're going to hell. Just so you know. But I said, thanks for the opportunity, but I am just absolutely opposed to the rollout of 5G. And I said, aside from the detriments to human biology and all animals, I said, please do some research on the effects on the bee population, because if the bee population continues to be decimated by glyphosate and from RF, we're done. That's how we make food.
That's actually...
So that was kind of my answer. Just like, please just research the bee thing, because that's like at the end of this whole EMF thing, that's where you end up. Like, that's where the collapse really happens, I think, personally.
I was hanging out and having lunch with a fellow named Bob Curl, who's one of the guys that got the Nobel Prize for discovering C-60, and he's like the super genuine, really nice professor emeritus at Rice, and he's just like a sweet human. And we were talking, and that actually, I think, of all the things that we discussed, that seemed to pique his curiosity more than anything else, was when we started discussing EMF and bees and the effects on bees, because I think really sharp guys like that, they realize that, as Einstein did too, you take out, it's the cosmic trigger is the effect my dad used to always say. It's like, oh, watch out, you've already pulled the cosmic trigger. Unknowingly and unwittingly, we do something that starts a chain of events that we can't recover from. And it wasn't the intended consequence, but it just dysregulates the entire system. Because people, I think very frequently we forget that we're just one little cog in a much larger organism, whether you want to like take kind of the Gaia hypothesis or whatever, but it's, we are a small thing in a very big system. It's one of the hypotheses I have about the viral stuff that's going on right now with COVID, is that it's more of it's a larger organism than people think of, right? People think of it as, oh, well, it's not even alive. Yeah, maybe in the classical sense of thinking of something as alive. But if you look at all of the people who are infected as maybe nodes on a mesh network, right? then you get all these points of inference, and something that was perhaps more like a superorganism on a much larger scale could actually get data points from something like that, right? Because if a virus, say, takes over mitochondria and replicates there, the first thing with any sort of spread is kind of like I had mentioned quorum signaling with bacteria. You take over communications, right? So how do mitochondria communicate? Pulses of light. How would that virus potentially communicate? Well, very, very plausibly, pulses of light. And pulses of light aren't something that stop when you leave, the proximity to that organism. They could be picked up from other organisms in close vicinity to it, which sounds, again, it sounds a little odd, but if you think about an ant trying to assess an elephant, the scale is wrong, right? You look at it and go, God, well, it's got this slight curve directly above me. And I think we're having the same problem assessing larger organisms, right? I think there's a consciousness that's associated with most things. And to think that there's not is just to put your head in the sand. And so it's gonna be difficult. I don't know that, overall people would be willing to accept that as an idea. And it may or may not be the case, but hypothetically, I could see some precedent for it. And I just think that it's akin to us looking at systems, not realizing they're connected in ways that they are connected. And again, that cosmic trigger idea of, you set something into motion because you don't realize that you're part of a much larger system. I mean, the planet perhaps could just be weeding us out in a way that it does every so often. I mean, if you look at pandemic curves, they're pretty normalized. There's a small wave and then a big wave and then a slightly smaller big wave. And that's happened pretty consistently for hundreds of years in most pandemics. Is that just random chance? No. Is it perhaps just because of the way things biologically grow and propagate? Yeah, possibly. But to me, it seems to smack of a much, much more in-depth sense of order. And usually if I look at something and I have the option of going, oh, it's random and stupid and I'm not going to pay attention to it, or go, there might be something there. I may just not really understand what it is yet. I'm generally inclined to pull the thread, and I'm wrong a lot, and I should say that, the guys in the lab, think that I just pull stuff off that's really cool all the time. And the reality is it's not the case. It's kind of almost like the tech approach of fail fast, fail often. I try a lot of stuff. And then in some cases, I have an intuition about how things probably function, and I will work backwards to prove it. One of those was our patent for anti-metastatics, and works like a champ. And in the data that we've got in dogs has been great so far.
Meaning preventing tumors from growing.
Well, not so much growing, because once they're in location in situ at their particular spot, they can actually grow, but spreading, right?
Oh, okay.
Entirely keeping them from spreading. And I will say definitively that, yeah, we can keep them from spreading. Like, I have not seen anything that would make me think there's any chance of metastatic spread after the fact. If something's already there, yeah, it can get a little blood flow and develop vascularity and actually grow in situ, but it's not going to spread. And there are a whole host of mechanisms that I use to actually stop that. Dropping cytokines, because not shockingly, cancer co-ops your body's immune system and uses it to signal for spread, and it uses interleukin 6 and interleukin 8. So if you suppress IL-6 and IL-8 while simultaneously upregulating mitochondrial function, you hit two of the major mechanisms that cancer needs, right? It doesn't want to kill the cell. It wants to debilitate the cell, drop its energy level so it can propagate, shunt the electron transport chain, and force everything into glycolysis so it continues to use that energy from the sugars to grow in lieu of allowing your cells to be healthy. So, you block it off and you get 2 moles of ATP instead of the 34 that happen after you move from glycolysis to the electron transport chain. And anyway, so that kind of mechanism, when we started looking at how cancer is spreading, it's very ordered and it's very well thought out. I mean, in terms of an approach, it's very well developed. Granted, it's had, who knows how many millions of years to develop like that. But if you want to block something like that, you have to think through the problem and pull the thread. And there was a point when we were doing that where I got some data back from one of the tests with a pathology lab at a university that we were working with. And they said, no, this doesn't work. And I knew that it worked. I could feel it. And just in my bones, I intrinsically was so committed to the idea. And so we pushed past the cellular data and went into an animal model, and it worked like a champ. But it was that, kind of that intuition of having to say, okay, sometimes you have an intuition and you know that something's going to work, so you see it through. A lot of times they're just wrong. But sometimes, I'll have that knowing of like, this is how this is functioning, work it out. And so I, run down that very path. But again, you have to be willing to go, I'm going to look stupid a lot of the time, and that's okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you win, 1 out of 10 of those, 1 out of 20 of them, it's a big win.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially talking about something like cancer that, no one seems to have been able to crack the code on really up until very recently. Little progress is being made. Let me see where I want to go with this here, because I know what we got to cover, and I got to check on let me check on the time here real quick. So I know we both have to be somewhere. Okay, 3. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's getting close.
Are we
to
running to the witching hour?
it's getting down to the wire.
We both turn into pumpkins.
We're gonna have to do how long are you out here? We're gonna have to do another one.
I literally I'm here through next Tuesday. So
okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I might not even be kidding, because there's a lot of shit I wanted to ask you about. But I think we can probably we can close this one out with the hair loss formula that you made. And I know it worked for you, and I haven't been as diligent. I need to, have a calendar and like the number of days and like really stick to it. I've used it here and there. So I didn't take before and after pictures. But I'm doing the little micro roller.
Yeah. Derma roller and red light.
Derma roller. Okay.
Yeah, derma roller and red light therapy.
I'm putting this serum on, and then I'm putting that DMSO, solution afterward, which doesn't bother my skin. I'm very tolerant to DMSO, luckily. But it seems like it's gonna work if I stick with it. So
yeah, it will.
How the hell did you come up with that? Because you'd think that if someone cracked this, they would just drop everything and be like, I cured male pattern baldness. I mean, like that would be like Nobel Prize worthy, and you'd have like huge website and be promoted. And
what's weird about that is I was doing a lecture like I guess it's been 3 years ago now, and I was talking about the developments on the anti-metastatic, and I was really jazzed because that I thought would make a big dent, right? Like can help a lot of people. And I mentioned the hair growth. And I think I put up one slide just talking about the hair growth. And then at the end of the lecture, everybody rushed up to the stage, and I thought, they're going to be asking about the cancer. Literally 100% asked about hair growth. And I thought, well, okay, fair enough. And so I literally just did it for myself because I understood the mechanism. And my daughter came in one day and said, Dad, your hairline's receding. And that day, I went to the lab and thought, yeah, that's not happening. So I just whipped up what I knew would fix it, used it, fixed it, put it back on a shelf, and didn't touch it for years because that's not what I was working on. And admittedly, that seems in retrospect maybe kind of stupid because, if I could probably fund every bit of research I ever wanted to do if that got out more. And maybe at some point it will. We're actually finalizing the patent on it now. It's been in process for a little over a year. And generally with patents, like you submit a patent, about a year later it comes back and they rebuff some points in it and say like, oh, you can't do it because of this, and you have to explain why, which is what we did a couple months ago with the office action that we received. So I'm sure it'll be coming out of the chute here soon, and then it'll be formally patented, as opposed to just being pending at this point. But it was honestly, it was really straightforward, right? So you got anagen, telogen, and catagen phases in the growth cycle, and my thought was, hair wants to do what hair wants to do, right? Hair follicles have a job; it's to make hair. So if they're inflamed, that's going to inhibit them. If they don't have enough energy, that's going to inhibit them. And granted, there's a lot of chemistry around, conversions from dihydrotestosterone and a bunch of that stuff. But that's all kind of, I always joke about, like a boat passes and the wake comes by and people are like, oh my God, these waves, we've got to stop these waves. Focus on how to stop the waves. Why don't you just have the boat go a different direction? It's again, for every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, there's one hacking at the root. Be that dude, right? So I thought the problem was a depletion in energy and an inflammatory response in the follicular cells. So I just eliminated that. And the reason I used the DMSO was because there's not a tremendous amount of blood flow up there. So I wanted something that would actually take those components and shuttle them in transdermally really rapidly into all the follicular cells. And, and it worked. And it was pretty simple. It works a whole lot better if you use the dermal roller, because it's kind of like, I don't know if you've seen like the PRP therapy. They do like the vampire facelift and stuff like
I've
that.
had that. Yeah.
Okay. Those things are fantastic. I mean, that works like a champ. I don't know what your experience was, but one of the women that works in our lab, she's done a bunch of those, and they are unbelievably impressive to me. Personally, I think I would try and tweak a couple things to maybe amp it up a little bit, because there's some room for improvement. But it just in comparison to like the normal course of events, very impressive. So when you use the dermal roller, it in kind is doing the same sort of thing. It's, doing like little micro perforations across the surface, because you're using like a 0.25 roller, right? So the little bitty needles. And then you allow that to kind of, basically you're irrigating the bed of follicular cells. And then you use the DMSO, it punches in, moves into the cells. Everything shifts in the mitochondria, drops the inflammatory responses out, and lo and behold, hair starts growing. And what's interesting though is having done this, for a couple of years now, is it grows back in retrograde from the way it went out, right? So like if it left on the front, it doesn't grow back on the front first. It grows from the place where it was, and it starts moving forward. That's why I always tell everybody to, take pictures, is because it's like watching paint dry, right? You get little bits of growth moving from the back, moving forward. And it just works. I actually wasn't going to commercialize it, but I was talking to Dave Asprey, and I had mentioned that, and he was like, whoa. What?
Right?
Yeah. And he was like, roll that back a second. You did what? And I told him, and he was like, do you have any of it? I was like, yeah, it's on the shelf in the lab. And so I sent him some, and I literally marked the package super secret ninja hair formula, and then put probably not final trade name, and he used it, and it worked for him. And that's like, he was a big proponent of it. And I used it for myself, and it works. But there's other things that you can do, like the dermal rolling, the red light, PRP. I'm a huge fan of, just because it's concentrated growth factors, right? So if you can do that, and most people, granted, probably don't have access to do that, but if you look at the photos of people that have had PRP therapy on their hair, it's fantastic. It'd be just like doing stem cells in the same spot. So yeah, it's good stuff. It's super simple.
How does in the protocol, you do the derma roller, you put the stuff on, then you put the activator on, then you do the red light while it's on your head?
Yeah,
you do. What does the red light do to potentiate that process?
So you drop out the inflammatory response, the C-60 moves into the mitochondria, and it's buffering oxidative stress, so you're producing more ATP and the cell's getting healthier. The red light at 670-ish nanometers hits cytochrome inside the cell. So you're oscillating a nitrogen or nitrous oxide atom off, and you're replacing it with an oxygen. So you're basically mechanically stimulating the cells. You're photonically stimulating the cell cycle. So you're using additive energy from the outside and forcing the cell to move through cellular respiration. So it's literally that. You're pulling energy from light, and you're advancing the cell cycle, so it speeds up the pace. Now, one thing I will caution you though is, like, you can't do it. Red light therapy is generally thought of as like a Janus mediator from the Greek god with two faces, right? Because there's a biphasic dose response curve, which is the fancy science way of saying that it's moving in kind of two different directions, right? So you can get one response up for about the first 10 to 13 days. You enhance the cell cycle, it gets better, but then it drops off. And when it drops to a point pretty precipitously that's generally lower than the initial point that you started at. And so that's why I told you is, what you do is you run it for a 10-day cycle, take 7 days off, then run it for another 10-day cycle. Then it becomes an additive function, and you don't have to worry about that biphasic drop. So it's just, and it paces it up. I mean, I'll show you some pictures of some of the guys that have done it like that. And it's pretty jazzy.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have my vanity,
Hey, man, anybody who thinks that, that isn't a factor is kidding themselves.
Yeah. It's funny when you think about like that, you're not your body. in the first place, let alone different parts of your body. But still, it's like you walk around in it. It's hard to remember that and not have some sort of.
I personally like it. It's like having a great car. I mean, I very much like having a functioning body.
And also I think we share that if something's broken, it's not meant to be broken. How do you fix it? And so when you told me about that formula, I was like, well, yeah, like why can't I have hair like I did when I was 20?
Yeah.
So I'm going to get a calendar in my bathroom so that I can mark off the days and like actually keep track of it. Cause that's where I kind of fell off. I was like, wait, how many days I do it? I better stop. And I wasn't disciplined enough about it, but I'm encouraged now. And also I've got one of the little portable Juve lights.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Little handheld one. So it's super easy. Just hang out, watch TV and just, blast my dome with
I literally used, when I was
Juve.
doing it, I used a $37 grow light from Amazon. It's like, yeah, this is the effect of growing up as a poor kid, right? You're always like shooting for it. What is the cheap seats version? Like the Sanford and Son approach to science.
Yeah.
So like, I can buy this or I can get a $37 grow light. Meh.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, if you have the right spectrum of light, then, the same difference, right?
Yeah. I mean, granted, the measure of intensity, the joules per centimeter squared, is a little different. Like a Juve is actually better. But, I don't know that everybody has the pocketbook to get the effect. I think there are probably a whole lot of people who really want their hair back that don't want to spend, $600, but spending $40, a whole lot more palatable,
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, dude, I had so many things on my list here that we didn't get to, but we covered a lot. And I think I'll just have to get you back and we'll just
My pleasure, man. It would be great.
A lightning round to just get your take on a bunch of shit that I do.
It'll be one-word answers. Yes.
Yeah.
No.
Do it. Don't do it. Like it.
Cantaloupe.
Don't like it. But I do have one closing question, and that is, who are 3 teachers or teachings that have influenced your life and your work that you might recommend our audience go check out?
Ooh. Let's see. Definitely one of the biggies was doing meditation. So, and I started out doing TM, right? So I did biofeedback therapy for a number of years when I was a little kid, and then that was kind of a precursor to doing meditation. And I've done that for 25 plus years now, and that was a big shift because I was a smart kid, but when I started meditating, it was suddenly like the lights turned on. Things made connections that had never made connections before. And it was expansive. So I would definitely tell anybody, find whatever flavor of contemplative work or meditative work that fits you and do it. Just be silent. Whatever that modality is, because there are a lot of them. So for me personally, it was TM. So Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was the fellow behind TM. Then other things that I think are really handy. I've seen a lot of technologies, but the one I've been using for the past year was Dr. Morgullen's Energy for Success stuff. That's legit. I mean, he has got that thing programmatically dialed in, and it's very different. And I also appreciate the fact that Dr. B is like double board certified MD. And when we have discussions about this stuff, he does not sugarcoat it, because I'll ask him a question and he'll flat out give me the answer, and he'll take it from the physical to the biochemical to the chemical to the the quantum physics level, and give me like the entire spectrum of answers, which for somebody that's geared the way I am is great, because I then go, oh, okay, got it. And I can move on, as opposed to wanting to like pull on that thing. So that's Energy for Success is what he calls the company.
Yeah, and he's been on the show, and I'll put it in the show notes. I forget the episode number, but one of my favorite interviews of all time. It was like one of these, like 2 hours, just
Dr. B he's great. We met at the Bulletproof conference. And he actually like plucked me out of just walked up to me and said, "You come with me. You're the person I'm here to meet."
Wow.
Yeah, and actually like plucked me out, and it was one of the best things I think that's probably ever happened to me, because the stuff that he's teaching is again, it's programmatic, right? It's like science. You do the experiment, you get the result. And his is no different. You put in the time, which is admittedly a bit of a bitch to do sometimes, because it's usually like 90 minutes a day of physical practices and then breathing exercises and things like that. And that's a chunk, especially because I don't sleep a ton, which is probably not the best thing, but I I really push a lot, and to carve out, a full 90 minutes every day is a lot, but proof's in the pudding, man. The effects are worth it. So if it makes you that much more efficient, it's worth doing. So that's definitely one. So I would say, meditation and Dr. B's stuff. Third thing, and this is a little bit odd. When I was in my early 20s, I was reading a lot, and I was really inquisitive, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. I kind of felt like I was at a concert, and I had lost all reference to the highs and the lows. I knew that there was a lot going on that I wasn't able to perceive, and this is probably kind of what pushed me towards really working on meditation in general. But it was a book called The Razor's Edge by W. Somerset Maugham, and it's not so much a teaching, but in terms of just an idea about getting perspective on things. Like, life is fleeting. Appreciate it. Try and make a difference and have a positive impact while you're here. And it's, that's my grandfather used to say, be good, do good, the rest will take care of itself. And that's just kind of that book sort of epitomized that to me. Is it's one of the reasons I left my job and I went kind of on a quest, kind of akin to yours, and went to a monastery and got used to silence so I could go off into the mountains and meditate my way to enlightenment. So it was this whole programmatic thing that I had worked out, which never actually came to pass. In the end, I ended up living the the standard kind of householder life and doing my gig. But as fate would have it, shockingly, it seems like I've been able to get more of a response and be more of a benefit here than in a cave. So,
it's a bitch, I know.
Actually the cave would have been a whole hell of a lot easier.
There's something about that renunciate path that definitely is the minimalist approach to it. But I guess you have to find your dharma and
that's it,
and go after it. And for some it's that, and for some it's coming back here and be like, okay, I'm gonna trudge through this and try and uplift in the ways that I can.
Well, I mean, actually doing what you're doing is huge because you've created a forum for people to find those sorts of things. I mean, the work that I do, it's at some point here in the near future, it'll become mainstream. But for right now, it's reasonably fringe. But, the people that listen to your show, they want to see the next thing, the cutting edge stuff, look at the science that isn't quite, considered to be normal science yet. And I think it makes a big impact. And, we're effectively kind of trying to do the same thing, move the needle where we are. Yeah. And so those three things, I think, the Dr. B's stuff, TM, and Somerset Maugham, those were three biggies for me. And then as an aside, John Gray. I think like that cat he's super legit. And his information about relationships, having read his books before, he's on point. Anybody who wants to relate with anyone romantically, do yourself a favor.
I 100%
read some John Gray stuff.
100% agree. Yeah. He's one of my favorite guests. He's been on 3 times. I've learned so much from him.
I have heard every one of those, actually.
Cool. Yeah. And it's funny because my girlfriend Allison, we met him in Park City. We went out for Dr. Harry Adelson's film launch out there, and a bunch of people in our field were there and whatnot. And so we got to go do a guided meditation with John. It was really cool. And that was her first time, I think, really encountering his work or him. She really vibed his whole thing because he's all about love,
Right.
A longtime meditator, but she has no idea that I'm using his stuff constantly in our relationship. I mean, she's like, dude, you're just such an amazing boyfriend. You really listen to me and you're there for me. And I'm like, I really just like learned from him.
Man, it's like the babble fish of relationships, right?
Yeah.
you mainline it and suddenly you understand how to interact. Like, oh, okay, this is what you meant.
Yeah, and I've just, I always give him so much credit because I'm one that when I encounter a teaching that rings true, I really do apply it. I mean, I don't know if this is one thing I've been able to do through all these interviews is when something really sticks with me, I just go for it and I use it. And John Gray's stuff, man, absolutely transformed my relating as well. I mean, just the simple act of understanding the fundamentals of energetics of masculine, feminine, and the hormonal, the endocrine systems of males and females. If you happen to be in a relationship that's that, but it doesn't really matter even the gender. It's just more about the energetics of it. But just like the one single thing of just really being a compassionate, caring listener and just shutting up and not trying to solve my girlfriend's problems.
Right.
Unless she asks and gives me permission, then I'm like, I know what to do. But just really, man, just being there and holding space and just not being, feeling threatened or getting all codependent and sucked into it, and just really just being there and being objective and compassionate. And it's incredible how much doing nothing actually does. That's just one little nugget. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of his teachings too. Okay, last thing, where can we find you online, website, social media, any of that stuff?
C360health.com is the company's website. And then, that's probably the first place to go to start pulling the thread. And I'm pretty easily accessible. I mean, lots of people call and just, go through the phone and get me on the horn and ask questions. And, anytime I'm able to help, I'm happy to do it. So
cool, man. Well, thanks so much. I'm glad we got to sit down today and finally get this done. And,
it was a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll call it, and we'll definitely have to do it again because, as I said, I have so much other shit I want to just wrap with you.
Yeah, we definitely can do the lightning round. I'll bring flashcards. It'll be
all right, man. Well, thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure.